Today, we are joined by John Sitilides. John is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors LLC in Washington, Senior Fellow for National Security at the Foreign Policy Institute, and a respected specialist in American geopolitical strategy, national security, international relations, and federal government relations. John's career spans 4 decades of strategic expertise, starting in the U.S. Senate and leading to geopolitical leadership roles in the U.S. Department of State, where he directed the professional development of American ambassadors and senior foreign policy officials posted in Europe and the Middle East under Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. His insights have guided decision makers across industries on navigating today's increasingly complex global landscape. John launched and directed 2 respected international relations institutes in Washington, testifies regularly before Congress, and continues to provide expert commentary on Bloomberg, CNN, Fox, and across international television, print, and digital media. Today, John will share his analysis of geopolitical and geo-economic developments, providing executive-level insights to proactively understand, anticipate, and mitigate risk in these highly disruptive and uncertain times across the global landscape. Following a briefing on global opportunities, John will be joined by Mark Ogunchusi, attorney, pharmacist, and partner with K&L Gates LLP, as well as a Modern Healthcare 40 Under 40 recipient, to answer all of your questions concerning global opportunities and the direction of recent federal healthcare initiatives impacting your IDN. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming John Sitilides.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to John Kelly for, first of all, inviting me to be here with all of you this morning and for that inordinately generous introduction. I'm not sure who that guy is. You're stuck with me this morning, but I'll do my best to try to fulfill some of the standards that are laid out there. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to come and speak with you early this morning, start out the day, to discuss some very hard truths and tough choices that our political leaders and our business leaders will be asked to make in the weeks and months and years ahead. We are dealing with some of the most profound geopolitical, geo-economic, and frankly, geotechnological policy shifts, if not outright shocks, in quite some time, obviously. And ladies and gentlemen, shortly around the time that he was being confirmed for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, former senator from Florida, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the era of America as the sole superpower on the world stage that we had known for 3.5 decades since the end of the Cold War was over, and that we have now entered a multipolar global order. And so I will start out the presentation with a very simple truth, ladies and gentlemen, that we are in a very different era. It's a much more complex era than anything we've known since the early 1990s. It's not unprecedented, and I'm going to fire hose you with a lot of very intense information this morning, but I'm very, very bullish on where America stands today and what the near future holds, because I'm the father of 4 young men in their 20s, and I'm extraordinarily excited about the future that they have. But we're going to go through a rough patch, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm just going to be very candid with all of you this morning. We're going to break down the presentation into sort of 5 subsets, several of them functional, several of them regional, and then I'm looking forward to the post-presentation discussion with Mark, and we'll try to tie all of this into your specific health industry concerns, and then what is happening sort of at the 30,000-foot strategic overview level. So what I have done for you, ladies and gentlemen, is I prepared what I would consider to be a simplified, generalized national security briefing using, of course, only open source intelligence. And let's get started, and we're going to go through a lot of data points. Again, it's going to be a little bit intense. Ride this out with me, and then we'll end on the uplifting, reassuring notes. So I'd like to start out with this amalgam of satellite photos of planet Earth, ladies and gentlemen. We're here in this beautiful part of the country, here in Phoenix, Arizona. But as terrestrial creatures, we often forget that about 70% of the Earth's surface is comprised of oceans, waterways, and seas. And on these waterways moves about 90% of global commerce by volume every year. And about 80% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas to power and literally lubricate the advanced industrial economies here in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, and those countries around the world that are seeking to attain our level of affluence and prosperity. This is a system, ladies and gentlemen, of free and open shipping that the U.S. inherited from the British Empire after its collapse after World War II. We have led it and are protecting it along with our allies in Asia, in Europe, in the Indian Ocean, around Africa, around Latin America, and certainly around the homeland here in North America. And this is a very fragile order, ladies and gentlemen, one that most of us either don't know about or take for granted. And it's under assault from several fronts around the world. So let's take a look at the outcome of these past 3.5 decades of a relatively globalized, just-in-time inventory global economy, where today we have sort of the global economy broken down into 3 categories, right? The US in blue here, the world's leading economy, about $30 trillion. But you see here an overwhelming reliance on services compared to industry, and we're going to touch on this during the course of the presentation. China in red, about a $19 to $20 trillion economy. Many believed as recently as 10 years ago it was on a trajectory to surpass the US by 2030. That is not going to take place in any realistic sense. But mind, ladies and gentlemen, the breakdown of China's GDP and what an industrial colossus it has become that's very much part of the disruption of the global order that we're experiencing currently. And then we have Japan and India right behind China here, and of course Germany here as the powerhouse of the European Union, although Germany is undergoing a very bizarre phase of deindustrialization before our very eyes. I might posit because of a sort of strange combination of overregulation, of absurd adherence to ideological climate policies, and the role of unions in preventing the kind of economic growth in Germany that we've experienced here in the United States and that our Asian partners are, especially in East Asia. So a couple of data points for your specific industrial perspectives, ladies and gentlemen. This is a snapshot here of global pharmaceutical exports into the US market. You see here, of course, that Ireland is the largest exporter of pharmaceuticals overall, followed by several other European countries. We'll touch on this as we discuss the Trump administration's tariff policies and trade negotiations. But a little bit more sharply, we see here that India, as you all know, is the leading exporter of active pharmaceutical ingredients into the US economy, followed by China and the European Union, together comprising about 85% of all API exports into the US market. So a very heavy reliance of the US health industry on these 3 exporting giants. And then, of course, there's China itself. Like in so many other sectors and industries, a preponderant role in the export to the United States of some key pharmaceuticals, something that many Americans had no idea of until we had the COVID lockdowns and the profound disruption to global supply chains and the realization that our national and societal well-being was largely dependent on the goodwill of the Communist Party of China. And I'm going to talk about this a few times, but somehow our political leaders, Republicans and Democrats, have failed to protect American society and our economy against these developments while we were unfortunately distracted in other parts of the world for the last quarter century. Now let's hone in specifically on the current administration's focus on trade imbalances. I'm right now in my second read of Art of the Deal. We're all supposedly scratching our heads trying to understand Donald Trump, who I will posit is about as open book as any politician we've had in America in decades, right? I followed him, actually I met him in 1986, the first time in New York City, but there's almost nothing about this gentleman that we do not know. And we know that from the 1980s, and you can just look at hundreds of YouTube videos, he has been single-mindedly focused on America's trade relations with other countries, rivals and allies and partners, to determine whether or not we're conducting our foreign policy and our trade policies correctly. And you see here, ladies and gentlemen, especially after 2000, that we have tremendous trade imbalances with both China and with the European Union. China on top, and you see here the Europeans right below over here at about a $500 billion trade surplus with the United States. Overall here, we're looking at $2 trillion worth of trade deficits, and this is something that President Trump is determined, rightly or wrongly, and we'll see how this plays out in the months and years ahead, to reorder, to achieve a new trade equilibrium with many of our leading partners around the world. And there are several markets that he's obviously singled out. China we know about, and we'll talk a little bit more about China later on, and the European Union. And I think when we talk about the European Union, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking here not only about, say, non-tariff trade barriers into the European market, but also in the context of Canada, which was kind of a head scratcher for me. Like, why are we going after Canada the way Trump did earlier this year? I understand why he was trolling Justin Trudeau, who he apparently despises as a leader, but Trudeau was succeeded by someone as hard to the left, Mark Carney, as Trudeau was. But I think part of that situation, ladies and gentlemen, is Trump's sense that these are countries that are being protected by American tax dollars. $900 billion a year until this most recent fiscal year. We're about to top $1 trillion in American taxpayer expenditures to defend this country and our allies around the world. Meanwhile, our European allies, many of those countries, are still spending 1.2, 1.3, maybe 1.5% of GDP on their own national defense in order to be able to provide for very generous cradle-to-grave social welfare programs, and the same thing in Canada. So I think President Trump is essentially having these countries pay for the American taxpayer subsidy of their security through higher tariffs. And Mexico and Vietnam are interesting because I think what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is over the last half decade or so, after the first round of Trump tariffs imposed on China in Trump 45 between 2017 and 2021, many Chinese companies sought to transship through Mexico, through Vietnam, into the US market to bypass those tariffs. And so President Trump is levying significant tariffs on these countries and imposing an additional transshipment tariff of as much as 40% on any goods that can be traced to Chinese origin, coming through second and third party countries like Mexico and Vietnam. And the European Union, I think, is in a real bind, ladies and gentlemen, because as a bloc, the EU and the US had about the same overall GDP in 2008, and the European Union has been somewhat off the rails over the last decade or so. You see here relatively anemic growth in major European Union countries in the last several years, recovering from the COVID lockdowns. The only reason that, say, Spain is doing as well as it is at 1% GDP on average, growth-wise, is because of the spike in Spanish tourism. But we have countries like Germany and France and Italy that are barely growing. And so we really have to rethink the US-EU relationship, and I think President Trump's thinking is they need access into the colossal and very rich US market more than we need access into their market, and we won't get into, for our purposes here because of limited time, the digital taxes that are being imposed, all of the concerns that he has about protecting America's technology sector operating in Europe. But I'm going to break down a little bit more why President Trump is undertaking some of the policies that he is. And we recognize that they genuinely believe, and he's got his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, on board, the guy that I call the Trump whisperer. It seems like maybe besides Rubio, or maybe along with Rubio, it's Bessent and Rubio that really have Trump's ear more than any other cabinet secretaries. But they're under the impression that they may be able to achieve $200 to $350 billion in additional revenue through tariffs for the US economy, for the federal budget. And that will help offset, now where we have trillion-dollar plus deficits, and I'm going to touch on that later on in the context of our defense expenditures, but also to offset some of the tax benefits that came to many Americans in this last bill, the tax cut bill that was passed several months ago. No new taxes on overtime, on tips, no taxes on Social Security, with conditions, of course, but to try to offset some of those budget revenue shortfalls. But I also take very seriously, ladies and gentlemen, President Trump's sort of promises made, promises kept pledge to his MAGA base. I remember in 2015 when we had the first round of the Republican primaries to succeed Barack Obama for the presidency, and I'll just speak personally, ladies and gentlemen, it was the first time I really came to understand how profound the fentanyl crisis was for so many of our fellow Americans, especially with the New Hampshire primaries in early 2016. And President Trump has made a pledge to his voter base and to the entire American body politic that he's going to address the fentanyl issue. And China, of course, was exporting fentanyl into the US economy up until around 2018, 2019. And thanks to heavy Trump pressure, they stopped exporting fentanyl. The problem is that they're exporting fentanyl precursor ingredients to Mexico. And then the drug cartels are manufacturing fentanyl and exporting them into the US, which is why Trump has this, I think, 25% tariff on China and Mexico and Canada for their fentanyl exports into the US. Although Canada's export is relatively minuscule, the problem is clearly in Mexico. I don't know to what extent the talk that we've seen over the last week about militarizing our response to fentanyl and drug exports into the US by attacking and bombing the cartel drug labs in Mexico. That, I think, would lead to a profound crisis in US-Mexico relations. But like a lot of Trumpian diplomacy, it could be pushing the envelope very, very far, knowing that in the end, you're going to have the other side come midway to where you want it to be originally anyway. All right, so since we're talking a little bit about Central America, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about North American hemispheric security, which is very important now in this administration, and give you two quick examples. One, of course, is Panama, which, as I recall, nobody talked about Panama during the presidential election last year. Neither former President Trump, neither President Biden, neither Vice President Harris, and yet the day after the election, we were talking about the possibility of taking over the Panama Canal. And a lot of this is caricatured in the media, I get that, but let me just offer two quick snapshots as to why this is actually a very important issue for the US economy and for our military and national security. It turns out that 40% of American trade with Asia passes through the Panama Canal. A lot of it is energy exports coming out of Texas and Louisiana, the agricultural basket, breadbasket of the Great Plains, down the Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, through the Panama Canal. But on the other side of this, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that it's a Hong Kong company that operates the ports at the Atlantic and the Pacific mouths of the Panama Canal. And before 2020, this wouldn't have been an issue because Hong Kong companies are nominally independent companies, except that the Chinese Communist Party in the summer of 2020 used our obsession with the COVID lockdowns to enact a national security law that this basically brings all Hong Kong companies under the authority of the Chinese Communist Party if the party deems it a national security issue. So this company, CK Hutchinson, sold off its ports, or tried to BlackRock several months ago, 40 ports around the world, including the two at the mouths of the Panama Canal, for about $23 billion. Unfortunately, the company forgot to ask permission from Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, who apparently was utterly infuriated that this agreement took place without his prior approval. So the Chinese authorities have now overtaken the process. They're still reviewing the documents. I think the deadline is coming up anytime soon. It may have just passed over the last weekend to see to what extent the Communist Party will allow the transaction to occur, or whether they will condition it with the inclusion of a major Chinese shipping company into this consortium, largely led by BlackRock. And if so, it will prove our worst concerns that Beijing actually does control port operations at both mouths of the Panama Canal. And then there's Greenland. Now, Greenland, ladies and gentlemen, some of you may have noticed back in 2018, 2019 was of interest to President Trump. It just didn't get a lot of media coverage. So much else was happening politically in Washington. And then, of course, in late 2019, 2020, COVID hit. But Greenland is actually a very important geopolitical and geo-economic issue for the United States, ladies and gentlemen, because keep in mind, when, I forget his first name, but when Mr. Seward's Folly, those of you who recall history, purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, the following year he sought to purchase Greenland from Denmark. Failed to do so. Would have been a very interesting piece of American history over the last 150 years if we bought Alaska and Greenland, right, bracketing Canada at the same time. But Greenland has been of strategic importance to the US, not only because of missile defense, because during the Cold War, missiles were projected to come into the US from the Soviet Union over the North Pole. The same thing with China over the North Pole. So missile defense, that includes Alaska, the Canadian frontier along the Arctic Ocean, and Greenland, but also because of vast critical metals and minerals and rare earth elements to be found in Greenland, and thanks to advanced technology now, more accessible for potential commercial usages. But ladies and gentlemen, we also have the warming of waters in the Arctic region. Russia is able to exploit this to allow for shipping along Russia's Arctic frontier about 6 months out of the year, mostly for energy, but potentially for cargo container ships. The extent to which we envision the potential, right now this is the area that's warming 6 months out of the year, basically April, May till about October, and then it freezes again. But if we have that kind of warming of waters along Canada's Arctic frontier here, you could see additional shipping lanes, ladies and gentlemen, and these provide for faster access from Asian markets to Northern European or North American markets by about a third. So you could see, especially for time-sensitive supply chain management, the importance of these faster supply lines across the Arctic region. And then those of you who maybe are as old as I am may remember what we called the Guyuk Gap during the Cold War, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, the importance of NATO bottling off the efforts of the Russian Navy and Air Force to come into the Atlantic Ocean and cut off supply chains between Europe and the United States in the event of a crisis. So we'll see how that plays out. There's not going to be an invasion of Greenland. I'm very confident of that. But there could be some condominium between Washington and Greenland if Greenland achieves independence. And if not, then maybe with Denmark. But for now, the Danish people, as you can imagine, are extraordinarily upset at the Trump administration for what they consider to be the belittling of their national interests in Greenland. And in the context of these larger shipping lanes, ladies and gentlemen, I want to just emphasize why the US, even though we're largely energy independent, right, with the technological revolutions of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling of about 15, 20 years ago, we don't need oil and gas from the Middle East anymore. So why are we so preoccupied with the Middle East? Let me offer two quick reasons. One is you have this, what I call the maritime superhighway that connects very wealthy East Asian markets through the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, maritime superhighway to Eastern African markets, South Asian markets, and through the Bab al-Mandab, which the Houthis cut off, right, in solidarity with Hamas for the last 2 years, up the Suez Canal and to European markets. So all of this here, ladies and gentlemen, connecting Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the like, is predicated on access through 3 critical maritime choke points all around the Arabian Peninsula. And so we want to help our Asian and European allies continue their road to prosperity by having these open shipping lanes that I highlighted with the initial slide, right? 90% of global commerce moving on the world's oceans, waterways, and seas. And if we close up, ladies and gentlemen, we see also that our Asian and European allies remain utterly dependent on Middle Eastern oil and LNG to power their economies in a way that we are no longer dependent. So to protect the global economy, essentially, which of course, if we have a major recession in Europe or in Asia, it'll redound in a very negative way to the American economy. So to help prop up the global economy and our trade ties to our European and Asian allies, we need to make sure that they continue to import the energy that they need because they're largely energy starved in Europe and in Asia. So these are sort of the two major reasons why we remain very much focused from a strategic perspective on the Middle East, which is why the Iran issue has been so important for multiple administrations over the last several decades. And it's interesting because President Obama signed the JCPOA, the nuclear energy agreement with Iran in 2015. President Trump withdrew from that agreement in 2018, and President Biden sought to re-enlist Iran in negotiations to come up with a sort of, part two of the Obama agreement to continue that earlier agreement and look to relax sanctions. We didn't enforce the sanctions on the sale of Iranian oil, especially to China, which is by far the largest consumer of Iranian oil in violation of US and international sanctions. But while the Biden administration extended an open hand of goodwill to get Iran back to the negotiating table, the Iranian regime was ramping up the enrichment of uranium in order to be able to produce enough weapons-grade uranium to build what Secretary of State Blinken under Joe Biden in December of last year, right, about a month after the election, but before President Trump was inaugurated, stated that Iran could probably build about 6 bombs, rudimentary bombs, nuclear bombs, in about 3 months' time, given the amount of enriched uranium it had in December of last year. And interestingly, right after President Trump was inaugurated in January, Iran even further ramped up its production of uranium, probably fearing that the Trump administration would look to take out the nuclear weapons program in Iran at some point, so to try and accelerate the pathway to a nuclear weapon so that it's a nuclear power and therefore deter the US from ever attacking Iran, right? Once it's crossed that threshold, kind of like North Korea, it limits our ability to respond appropriately. And coupled with Iran's growing ballistic missile capability, ladies and gentlemen, we see here that if in the eventual future, Iran is able to take nuclear warheads and place them on ballistic missiles, we see a major threat to about 40,000, right, 40,000 American troops that are based throughout the Middle East currently, as well as very important US interests, assets, and expats all around the region in Southern Europe and South Asia and Eastern Africa. And ladies and gentlemen, we also have the Defense Intelligence Agency. By the way, this slide deck will be available to everyone. It's non-proprietary afterwards. So you'll want to look at this slide here in particular because the Defense Intelligence Agency projects that Iran will have probably 60 medium-range ballistic missiles by 2035 at the pre-strike on Iran trajectory. That, of course, has been upended. This slide over here, by the way, was just declassified by DIA. You're one of the few people that has seen this over the last couple of months since it was declassified. And so we needed to prevent Iran from achieving that missile capability with nuclear weapons. And so President Trump signed off on Operation Midnight Hammer. We took out the Iranian nuclear weapons facilities. They're going to try to rebuild that nuclear weapons capability, for certain, as long as this regime is in power. If they're overthrown by their own people, that's a different story. But as long as this radical, theocratic Shia regime is in power in Iran, my sense is they will continue to try to build a nuclear weapons program. So that threat will remain for the foreseeable future in the Middle East. Okay, so the other theater of war, let's move a few hundred miles north to Russia, Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen. The late Senator McCain once, I think, misguidedly joked that Russia is essentially a gas station with nuclear weapons. It's cute, but it's not accurate. Ladies and gentlemen, I take Russia deadly seriously every day of the year. It's become kind of a caricature country with all of the election interference accusations in 2016 and the like, but Russia spans 11 time zones. It is a vast country, and whoever governs Moscow, Vladimir Putin currently obviously, governs 1/8 of the world's landmass. And it is able to project power, almost always in malign ways, in Eastern and Central Europe, as the suffering millions in Ukraine have come to know, in the Middle East, in Africa, where there are mercenaries from Russia that are defending sheikdoms and kingdoms and dictatorships in Africa and oppressing the rights of the people there. In South Asia, China and Russia have a tenuous relationship. They're tactically allied right now against the US, but they actually had a brief conflict when Russia was the Soviet Union in 1969. Russia still challenges the sovereignty of a number of northern Japanese islands. It is just across the Bering Strait, another maritime choke point, from the United States of Alaska, right here, where Presidents Trump and Putin met 2 weeks ago. And it is becoming the dominant military power in the emerging strategic theater, as I just outlined before with Greenland, in the Arctic region, which we'll chat about briefly. Now, we know that India, a very important country from the pharmaceutical perspective, is screaming in pain because of the Trump tariffs that are being imposed on India for continuing to buy massive amounts of Russian oil, and from President Trump's perspective, fueling Putin's ability to fund a military invasion and ongoing devastation of Ukraine's economy, and thwarting President Trump's efforts to try to bring about either a ceasefire or an overall political settlement. But keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that India is not the largest consumer of Russian oil and gas. It's China, which has been largely exempt from any Trump threats right now, I think because Trump has in mind some type of a grand bargain, probably involving access to markets, technology, fentanyl, Taiwan, and the like, and we'll see if there will be some type of talks between President Trump and General Secretary Xi by November. Trump seems to be hinting at that, but the Chinese are very, very quiet on this. But notice also, ladies and gentlemen, that NATO ally Turkey is a major consumer of Russian oil and gas, and the European Union, to this day, continues to buy vast quantities of liquefied natural gas, which it never sanctioned after the 2022 invasion, interestingly enough. So while they're coming here and asking President Trump to have the American taxpayer continue to protect Europe from Russia, they're helping to fund Russia's military operations in Ukraine by remaining dependent on Russia for LNG. Now, Russia, as John McCain hinted, is not only a nuclear superpower, ladies and gentlemen, but it is also a commodity superpower. It exports oil and gas and coal, but also timber, diamonds, natural resources such as critical metals, minerals, rare earth elements, foodstuffs and fertilizers to help feed billions of people around the world every year. And it's why Russia has been largely immune, to a large degree, from the US-EU-led sanctions regime of the last 3.5 years. My own sense is, from the open source intel, is that Putin knew that as soon as he invaded Ukraine, there would be significant sanctions from the West. So he had his people consult with North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, all of these countries that have suffered under US-led sanctions over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years to try to sanctions-proof his economy as best as possible. Now, there's also been the sugar high of the 24/7 wartime military production, where Russia is producing rockets and missiles and artillery shells not only far faster than Europe can produce and provide to Ukraine, but faster than the US is able to replenish our inventory, as we've been sending inventory to Ukraine and also to Israel for its war against Hamas. So we don't know to what extent the Russian economy will be able to endure sort of these sanctions for the next 2 to 3 years, but Putin seems to think his economy will outlast the attrition of Ukraine, which is why I think you're seeing this massive devastation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, of its civilian areas and whatnot this summer. And this will likely go on deeper into the fall, and we'll see then if Putin decides to re-engage with President Trump and possibly with Zelensky. So this is the map, ladies and gentlemen, that was in the White House, in the Oval Office last week, when President Trump brought President Zelensky and several European leaders into the Oval Office. And you see here that Russia is sitting on about 18 to 20% of Ukrainian territory. I'm highly confident that Ukraine is not going to get back the Crimea Peninsula. This has been a major area of dispute between the Russian and Ukrainian people ever since Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in 1783. It's Russian and it's staying Russian. It's pretty much off the table. Territorial concessions for security guarantees for Ukraine will likely be the gist of negotiations in the latter part of this year, in 2026. We'll see how this all plays out. But I'm very much concerned that the war is pretty much lost for Ukraine. It's really difficult to conceive how they're going to break through this triple-layered strategic in-depth defenses that the Russians have built into 600 miles long, a frontier between those oblasts that I showed you before in eastern Ukraine, all the way down to Crimea. And I think what you're starting to see realistically from a US perspective is first of all, the monetization of the Ukraine situation. So President Trump entered into the US-Ukraine minerals, oil, and gas deal for any new discoveries of these resources in Ukraine, in which the US is now a partner, and very importantly, invested in the sovereignty, security, and hopeful prosperity of Ukraine, and also monetizing the delivery of American arms. Under President Biden, anywhere from $80 to $100 billion in arms were essentially gifted to Ukraine. But there was no exit strategy, and there was never any negotiation. So what's the point of arming Ukraine permanently if there's actually no pathway to negotiations? So what President Trump is doing is saying, okay, Europe, you want to continue providing American arms to Ukraine? Buy them from us, and then give them to Ukraine. So we now have this investment deal in Ukrainian natural resources, and we're selling US arms to European countries, which are then gifting them or granting them or loaning them, not loaning, but leasing, to the Ukrainians. The other issue to keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, is the reconstruction of Ukraine will likely cost right now about $500 billion. This is something on the order of 5 times greater than the US Marshall Plan, adjusted for inflation, that was used to rebuild all of Europe after World War II. It'll cost 5 times more than that to rebuild Ukraine. And BlackRock is already at the forefront of a number of US and European companies that are looking to try to begin to plan for that reconstruction, that hopeful reconstruction of this devastated country. Okay, now let's start to switch over a little bit towards East Asia and look at the roles of countries such as Russia and India, other great Eurasian geopolitical powers, and China, to try to reconfigure the global order, as I mentioned earlier, that Secretary of State Marco Rubio concedes is now a multipolar global order. So the BRICS alliance, or network, it's really not an alliance, of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that was formed very tenuously in 2008, has kind of regrouped in the last several years in a more significant way, largely in response to the Biden administration's weaponization of the US dollar and the American dominance of the international financial system to try to punish Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And so what I think you have now is a number of countries that are saying, wait a second, we may be in the crosshairs of the Trump administration or a future Democratic or Republican administration for something like an outright invasion, or maybe because we have a human rights or social inequity policy that a future American administration doesn't like. So we need to have some alternative, some measure of strategic financial depth, so we're not completely dependent on the US dollar and America's dominance of the international financial transaction systems, like the SWIFT system, to be able to conduct bilateral or intralateral trade within BRICS, and maybe instead trade in our own local currencies. So for instance, Russia is selling oil and gas to China and getting renminbi, not dollars, right? So you have many of these countries that are looking to trade in their local currencies. Now, some are concerned that this may threaten the global leadership of the US dollar as the reserve currency, but there's really no serious threat coming from the yen, from the renminbi, from the euro, from any other currency. But the dominance of the US dollar as the reserve asset is already being challenged, and you see just the last several years increasing demand for gold, silver, oil, special purpose vehicles, even Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency to possibly serve as not necessarily replacements, but alternatives to the dollar as a reserve asset. Now, China has been able to exploit its position, first of all, as the modern inheritor of a great civilization dating back 4,000 years. Until the early 1800s, ladies and gentlemen, keep in mind China and India together were the two largest economies in the world until Europe, Great Britain really, and then the US began to take off in the mid to late 1800s. China is now looking to restore what it considers to be its rightful place atop the global economy, and it is very skillfully, some might say cunningly, exploited its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, A, before it was fully compliant with WTO accession criteria, and B, before our leaders in Washington, again, Democrats and Republicans, this was Clinton and Bush 43, allowed China into the WTO without ensuring that we had enforcement mechanisms in place that they would comply with WTO criteria, which they have not done for the last 25 years. And now they have taken advantage of both their WTO position and their very, very entrepreneurial society, hardworking Chinese that have prospered despite the best efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to control the economy, especially at that entrepreneurial mom and pop level, especially now with Xi Jinping bringing state-owned enterprises into sort of a greater role in the overall Chinese economy. But you see here the latest stats, ladies and gentlemen, that China's industrial production, right, its manufacturing exports exceed those of Germany, the US, and Japan combined. Quite a stunning place in the global economy. And according to the United Nations International Development Organization, UNIDO, China was accounting for about 23% of global industrial production, maybe 5 or 7 years ago. Right now it's at about 29 or 30%. And on the current trajectory, depending on what happens in the US economy, in the European economy, and those of our East Asian partners, China is on track to account for 45% of all global manufacturing output in just 5 years. And obviously, to the diminution of the US, which would be reduced to about 11%. And you see here, Japan 5, India 3, Germany 3, South Korea 3. So I think part of what the Trump administration is looking to do with tariffs, with these trade negotiations, and we don't know if he'll succeed, is to try to reshore as much as possible manufacturing and industrial production in the US. It's a whole larger discussion as to whether or not our sort of wage levels are competitive, right? That's obviously a very important question. A whole host of regulatory issues that companies do not face when they're building in countries like China and other parts of the world. So I don't know whether they'll be successful, but this is a major issue because I don't believe the US can long remain a global military and economic and political superpower. Remember that early slide, with an 80% services economy and only 19 or 20% industrial output. If you don't have a self-sufficient industrial base inside your country, you cannot long sustain your military might and prowess. So in addition, what the Chinese have done is undertaken 3 significant technological initiatives, ladies and gentlemen. Made in China 2025, they identified about 10 major sectors, including biopharmaceuticals and synthetic biology, but artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, renewable energy, electric vehicles and batteries to match, aerospace and the like, and poured in what some estimate to be as much as $3 trillion over the last 10 years to make China a major player in these leading technological industries of the 21st century, moving away from its prior role as basically a producer of cheap goods for export into the US and other markets. Couple that with China Standards 2035, where the Chinese government announced in 2019 that those technological sectors where it becomes a dominant player, it would seek to establish the norms and values and standards and platforms for global interoperability of these Chinese-led technologies, like solar panels, right? They pretty much have that market cornered, like electric vehicles, and they're now flattening out Germany's role as a leading auto exporter around the world, and I'm wondering where Tesla's Chinese production will be in the next 5 or 10 years. But think about this also, ladies and gentlemen, the astonishing material prosperity that we in the West and our allies enjoy today is predicated on the global interoperability of technologies founded upon innovation, dynamism, openness, and freedom that we enjoy in the West. But if the Chinese Communist Party is determining the platforms and values and norms and standards for global interoperability, are we looking at a global economy in the future marked more by a techno-authoritarian surveillance governing system that strips human beings of data privacy, of individual liberties, and of privacy, as we see in modern-day China today? And then also, the Chinese government, and there was an interesting Wall Street Journal report about 2 years ago, you can look this up, has unleashed what is known as Document 79. The colloquial term for this is Delete A, for Delete America. And this is Xi Jinping's order to state-owned enterprises in China to become independent of American/Western hardware and software information technologies by 2027. De-risking, decoupling the Chinese state-owned enterprise ecosystem from dependence on the West, given all of the technological competition that we see between Beijing and Washington. China has very skillfully been able to use these investments in their domestic technologies to become the world leader in industrial robots by far. And you're seeing now many of these astonishing videos coming out of China in terms of what we call embodied intelligence, not just AI, fun apps in our smartphones and the like, but embodying intelligence into their humanoids, not to replace their workers, but really to complement the Chinese society, Chinese labor force, and to provide for services for an increasingly aging society, given China's astonishing demographic decline that we're expecting in the years and decades to come. And much of this, of course, will play out in your sector, ladies and gentlemen. This is currently the status of revenue coming in from industrial and service robots, and you see the medical field is the leading industry worldwide, along with a number of others right behind it in terms of the application of these technologies for the sake of prospering and developing the next level of technological achievement in the medical field. But this is an area of profound importance to all of you as you're planning your corporate and investment portfolio activities in the years to come. I want to just take this over a little bit more into the pure technological direction, ladies and gentlemen, because we have to talk a little bit about Taiwan and the urgency in Washington of deterring and dissuading China from undertaking anything reckless against Taiwan that could lead to a recession, if not something worse, more cataclysmic. Now, Taiwan has been an important part of U.S.-China relations for decades, mostly on the diplomatic side. We don't need to get into all of that right now. But from a pure economic or geo-economic and geotechnological perspective, you see how heavily dependent we've become on Taiwanese semiconductors coming into the United States, because Taiwan really has a stranglehold on the most advanced semiconductors, producing about 90% of those that we need for military hardware, space communications, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, and the like, as well as the general use of semiconductors worldwide for, say, almost every single type of technological device that we now use in the West. But we're very much concerned that China wants to absorb Taiwan for nationalistic reasons, for political reasons. The Chinese Communist Party resents that there is a free market democratic system governing ethnic Chinese people, which gives lie to the Communist Party's position that only it can manage China's vast and complex society and economy, but also because it wants to be able to project power throughout East Asia. So what we see here, especially since the August 22 visit by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, furious Chinese responses to any type of activity that seems to allow Taiwan to better defend itself against a potential amphibious attack from China. And what we have is a series of military exercises that American naval commanders are now saying are really less a matter of exercises and more seemingly a series of military rehearsals for a possible blockade or invasion of Taiwan. We are working with a number of our allies in East Asia to maintain this, what we call the first island chain, ladies and gentlemen, which spans from Japan down the Japanese archipelago into Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia here in the South China Sea, in order to constrain China's very belligerent activities in the South China Sea, which claims up to 1,000 miles of international waterways as a sovereign Chinese lake, threatening that free and open shipping system that I described earlier, and looking to project power if it's able to establish air and naval bases on Taiwan deep into the Pacific Ocean and even into the Indian Ocean here. That maritime superhighway that I described earlier is an area of vital economic interest to China as well. And so they would look to compete with the US-led free and open shipping system in the Indian Ocean as well. And it's in our national interest and those of our allies to deter and dissuade from China from doing so. In the event that things don't work out well, and Xi Jinping decides tomorrow that it's a good day to go ahead and move forward with plans to absorb Taiwan, a possible conflict that draws in the world's number 2 economy, China, almost definitely the number 3 economy, Japan, the number 10 economy, South Korea, the number 20 economy, Taiwan, and then possibly the US coming to Taiwan's defense, would absolutely flatten Taiwan's economy with the disruption of the most advanced semiconductors that I just described throughout the world, probably setting off a significant global recession, if not an outright depression in the Asian economy, which right now at about 40% of the global economy would obviously have immediate and profound repercussions for the American economy and for the global economy writ large. But we face some headwinds here, ladies and gentlemen, in effective deterrence and dissuasion because, first of all, what used to be the global arsenal of democracy, those of you who love World War II history, will come to understand that the US right now is a puny shipbuilding power on the world stage. It's almost completely dominated by China, by Japan, and by South Korea. The statistics show, unfortunately, that we have about 1/200th, that's correct, 1/200th of China's shipbuilding capability. So they are putting out ships, naval vessels, at a far faster rate than anything we have seen on the world stage since the 1930s. And we have 2 shipyards that are able to function with very onerous federal procurement and acquisition regulations in place. So we're now looking at the possibility of outsourcing, not just the repair, which currently takes place, of American naval vessels in countries like South Korea and Japan, but the actual construction of those ships, except that it puts them at risk because of their proximity to China of immediate devastation in the event of a conflict. So this is something that we're looking to turn around with major shipbuilding incentives coming out of the administration and the Congress this year. Keep in mind also that China is looking to become a major nuclear superpower along the lines of Russia and the United States. For several decades, it had 50 to 200 nuclear weapons simply as a deterrent in case the Soviet Union, with which it was an enemy during most of the Cold War, and the US ever thought of a first strike against China. It is now at about 500 nuclear weapons, and our intelligence agencies estimate it'll have about 1,000 warheads by 2030, about 1,500 warheads by 2035, and Beijing has zero interest in any arms control talks with the US, with Russia, with any international body. So this is going to be a pressing issue for the US. It's one of the reasons why we need to restore diplomatic cooperation with Russia. Many of you may not be aware that we are right now in the last parts of the START, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement with Russia. It expires in February of 2026. If we don't have a good working relationship with Russia and that arms control agreement expires, you can expect an arms race, a nuclear arms race between China, Russia, and the United States, and that cost is going to be staggering, let alone the danger that it poses to the international order. So one of the things the Trump administration is looking to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to sort of reconfigure what is a very Europe-heavy allocation of military assets, right? 80 years after the end of World War II, with a very prosperous European Union, although, as I pointed out earlier, gradually deindustrializing. and move many of those assets to Asia to better defend our allies, our own interests in the Indo-Pacific region, and again, to deter and dissuade China from doing so, and is one of the reasons why I think President Trump wants to deconflict Ukraine as quickly as possible, help establish a new security architecture in Europe where our NATO allies defend themselves more effectively. We provide the nuclear umbrella, but they ramp up their spending from 1.5 to 3.5 and 5% of GDP. If they're genuinely terrified of Russia, spend like it, right? So we'll see if that's going to be successful. But we have to be very careful in how we're dealing with China in all of these issues, ladies and gentlemen, because they've made very clear that they will exploit their deep leverage over the US economy, and frankly, that again of the global economy, with their absolute dominance of rare earths productions, processing, and refinement. And part of that is the essential need of the US economy for rare earth magnets that we need for everything that has a rotor. Everything requires rare earth magnets, and this is something that really we haven't paid attention to again until the last several years. The US was a rare earth elements leader until the 1980s and 1990s, but because it's such an environmentally degrading business, we were very happy to achieve more pristine environmental standards in the US and frankly in Europe as well, to outsource it to the Chinese, who were very happy to take on environmentally degrading operations and have now leveraged that dominance in order to hold the American economy hostage. If we limit the sale of semiconductors and aerospace parts of the Chinese economy, they come back and say, well, we're going to have to ramp up the licensing requirements for you to be able to buy rare earth magnets. That affects our auto industry, our aerospace industry, our advanced technology sector, and really almost everything that requires rare earth elements to be able to power everything that is critical to our effective day-to-day operations as an American society. And so the Chinese are going to be reviewing this arrangement every 6 months, maybe until there's a permanent equilibrium, a new equilibrium between Beijing and Washington on the trade front. But the degree to which America has the political will to deal with all of these issues around the world, ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with a fiscal disorder in Washington, D.C., where our expenditures on Social Security and Medicare are pretty much out of anyone's control, right? These are entitlement programs with automatic escalation of benefits. Medicaid is now becoming a major expenditure, so we have sort of 2.5 and soon 3 major social entitlement programs that are untouchable by our political leadership. So you can vote however you want, but until there's actual reform of 1, 2, or 3 of these programs, these are essentially runaway entitlement programs. And we now have, for the first time, federal debt service exceeding $1 trillion a year because of high interest rates and $37 trillion in accumulated debt, because we have annual deficits of $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. We almost had $2 trillion. Well, this is obviously not sustainable, but no one seems to be doing anything about it because politicians, and I don't mean to be so cynical, but they seem to be willing to let this go on to the next generation of political leaders because the decisions to reform entitlements would be so painful that many of them would likely either be primaried or lose in a general election. But the problem with $1 trillion of debt service, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is now crowding out the defense budget to deal with all of these geopolitical, geo-economic, and geotechnological disruptions around the world. And I don't know to what extent we're going to be able to maintain the level of defense spending that we need to, given the complexity of all of these new arrangements. All right, so now we'll start to close out, ladies and gentlemen. AI, I think that it would have been very difficult for anyone 5 years ago to predict the astonishing demand increase for power to be able to provide for the AI advancements that we see right now. Renewable energy in the United States does not provide the base load that these data centers and AI companies and frankly the vast electrification of the US economy in the last half decade requires. And you see here that in just a few decades, computing will take up more electricity demand than almost every other sector in the US economy, according to the Department of Energy. And the question becomes, where do we provide for all of this electricity and overall energy production capability? It will likely require a nuclear renaissance in the US economy. Right now, the US is the leading nuclear generating power on the world stage, but China is building anywhere from 80 to 120 nuclear power plants that they believe they'll have online by 2040. So in addition to being the world's leading provider and builder, user of solar panels, they're also the world's largest producer and consumer of coal. So they are emitting into the atmosphere more carbon emissions than we're saving in America and in Europe, offsetting any of our clean energy activities. And now with an all-of-the-above approach, also becoming a nuclear power colossus. Now you see here, ladies and gentlemen, as I just mentioned, thanks to China's coal usage, its carbon emissions have skyrocketed while we're hampering many of our own economic activities with very ideologically rigid climate policies, especially in countries like Germany, the UK, and the like, which are deindustrializing before our very eyes, whereas the US has been reducing its carbon emissions not because of climate policies per se, we really haven't achieved what the Europeans have, but because of technological advancements in energy. And the degree to which we keep talking about an energy transition, ladies and gentlemen, there's really no historical precedent for one. If you see here, energy demand has always been ahead of energy supply, so as new energy forms come online and are scalable and affordable and reliable, they meet on top of one another. Biomass, which still provides energy for several billion people around the world, animal dung and wood chips, coal on top of animal dung and wood chips, oil on top of coal, gas on top of oil, and now we have solar, wind, nuclear, hydropower, geothermal, but there's energy addition, but there's no energy transition, at least not to date. This could change depending on energy technology breakthroughs in the years to come, but today there's no such thing as energy transition. And as a matter of fact, the world continues to produce and consume more oil, more gas, and more coal in recent years than any time in human history. And the trajectory continues to be an upward and forward one for the foreseeable future. And even OPEC sees that between now and 2050, there's going to be a continued significant increase over 25 years. It'll be cyclical, but the general trajectory is forward and upward for oil demand at least through 2050. So I close on this note, ladies and gentlemen. I will posit that it is a net positive that the US remains the world's leading producer and exporter of crude oil around the world, and the world's leading producer and exporter of natural gas around the world, to give the US economy the ability to withstand the kind of geopolitical, geo-economic, and geotechnological disruptions that I've just tried to outline for you in the last several minutes or so. And again, as the father of 4 young men, I've given you a lot to work with here, but the US retains the largest economy in the world, the largest military in the world. Everyone comes to America for diplomatic solutions to their problems with their neighbors. We have the greatest financial markets in the world, a robust labor market, the rule of law, contracts are respected here, and we have, generally speaking, a very cohesive American society compared to the rest of the world. Very imperfect in the US, no doubt about it. But I always say, compared to who? There's no other country that can match America's gifts, America's powers, and America's potential. But it all depends on the wise stewardship of our political and our business leaders. So I will close on that, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for having me. I thank you very much for your interest and time, and I think we're going to go into a Q&A or discussion session. So thank you all very much. Thank you. I'm sitting here, right?
Great.
Okay.
Great
Thanks,
job.
Lena. Thank you.
Please join me again in thanking John for that incredible presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, here's your
Can we greet Mark?
for you,
Thank you.
if you need it. All right, gentlemen, if you'd like
Hey,
to
Mark. Good to see
have
you
a
again.
seat.
Good seeing you.
All right, let's move into the Ask Me Anything phase here. So first of all, I'd like to thank John for that insightful presentation, understanding our global economy and guiding us with our focus on supply chain. Really helpful perspective for all of us. So thank you for that. This is some heavy information, so we're going to drill into a little bit through this next question and answer period. I'm going to start with a quick introduction. My name is Leanne Bourne, and I am privileged to partner with the IDN Summit around the educational content creation. And this morning, I'm honored to be on the stage with Mark and John and moderating this Q&A session. Please be on the lookout for Trey and Josh and Owen out there. Raise your hand if you have any questions for John or Mark, and they will come out to you, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions. With that, though, I am going to start with our first prepared question, but then please look for those folks to get the microphone. Mark, we've just heard some incredible information from John. So can you help us bring together John's overview of the global economy with our healthcare legislation and the current administration? What should we be aware of as it relates to supply chain and the issues we're dealing with today?
Yeah, so if this thing is on, can you hear me?
Yep.
So yeah, the three main subjects, and I was listening to John's presentation, which was amazing, that I'd be concerned or focused on. One is the impact and the risk that the country faces with respect to China, India, not really Ireland, but China and India with respect to active pharmaceutical ingredients and other raw materials. I never really appreciated the fact that, China's responsible for 80% of global, generic active pharmaceutical ingredient throughout the world, and India about 20%. So I thought that was pretty informative. If I'm thinking about the implications of that position, at the end of the day, if we want to maintain our global hegemony, we have to maintain global trade, and we can't suffer from trade deficits. So we should expect shortages. We should expect immediate impact on the cost of goods to consumers with respect to drugs that are mainly generic products, where those active pharmaceutical ingredients are being manufactured elsewhere. I thought it was pretty noteworthy. The trade deficit, roughly $1.2 trillion. For those of you out there who aren't global trade experts, trade deficit's basically, if the country is importing more than it's exporting, right, John? Mm-hmm. And of that 1.2 trillion, roughly 139 billion is due to pharmaceutical trade deficits. So here we are in the most powerful country in the free world, and we pay 300 to 1,000% more for drugs in the US than any other developed country in the world, according to the Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation, and we're importing more product than we're exporting. And so that's kind of the underpinning of the Trump administration's goals. Another important point, I think, is stockpiling, right? We're seeing providers purchasing more, trade supply chain participants purchasing more product in anticipation of shortages as a result of these tariffs. So those are the kind of most important factors. I get it, it's going to be hard. It's going to be pressure. What do you say? Trump administration is pressuring 250% tariffs on products if manufacturers do not comply with the most favored nation pricing requirements. So when I see that, I'm expecting my clients, at least, health systems, to see higher drug prices, both brand and generics. Because even when brand manufacturers, Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, Roche, some of those that have, AstraZeneca, have announced billions of dollars in investment in plants to domestic production, well, that costs more money, right? Producing products here is more expensive than producing products elsewhere. So, I anticipate supply disruptions in both, namely in the generic market, but I also anticipate rising costs in the short term, coupled with the Trump's pressures to reduce prices with the most favored nation.
Great, thanks, Mark. Let me open it up to the audience. Do we have any questions out there? I think I see one over here.
Good morning, John. Your friend Regine here.
My new friend.
Yes.
So good to see you again.
Now remember, what happened last night stays last night, right?
Are we in Vegas?
We all had dinner last night together.
Thank you so much for all of this information that you provided to us. This was really insightful. I truly appreciated it and feel like I want to hear more. So thank you for the gift of your time for that. So I have a question for you. When you spoke about tariffs, so what's the legal basis for tariffs specifically in pharmaceuticals? And what's the historical precedence for that?
So I will try to answer that partially, but I'm probably going to have to defer to Mark. And I apologize, Mark,
this
for
will
just
work
tossing
really well
it to
for
you.
both of us.
Because I think he knows from the legislative and regulatory side better than I do, specifically to pharmaceuticals. And I can't single out the legal basis for this, but as you probably all know, there may be a constitutional question here. To the best of my knowledge, there's a very serious challenge to the Trump administration on the power of the executive to be able to unilaterally impose these types of tariffs. And not only to impose them, but to basically retain the ability to change them at will. I mean, that's also part of the uncertainty for many of our trading partners. And when I hear them speak, they say, okay, let's just say, put the constitutional question aside for a second. We have this new tariff regime. It's 25%, it's 15%, it's 40%, depending on the country, depending on fentanyl and transshipment and the like. But at least finish this so that our companies can figure out what their new trade arrangements will be, and we have this new equilibrium going forward. And I think the measure of uncertainty from the Trump administration is there's no guarantee these tariff rates will stay where they are. They could be changed in 6 months or in 2 years or whatnot. So that's the long-term concern for many of our trading partners. But before we get there, Regine, to your question, there are challenges right now, I think, in several courts. I'll let Mark flesh out the details there. But the sense is that really only Congress has the constitutional authority to engage in trade arrangements with other countries. And what President Trump has been doing is what one might call a very energetic interpretation of recent laws that allow for greater authority to the executive branch under so-called national emergencies. And the degree to which President Trump has been able to declare a national emergency in category A, B, or C has given him, the White House lawyers believe, the authority to negotiate unilaterally on these trade arrangements. And that's under challenge now, and it may be completely overturned, and we go back to a status quo ante of January 19th, 2025, and all of our trade and tariff arrangements then. And then maybe the administration would have to come to Congress and say, okay, we're going to negotiate agreements more formally, but that's going to be a very lengthy, very complex process. And even right now, and I'll conclude on this, many of our trading partners are concerned that what they have is a 2-page outline of what the new trade arrangements are. And trade agreements, we're talking about, right, multi-$100 billion trade agreements are usually 250, 300 pages of legalese. And no one has anything like that yet. So all of this is very fluid, very much in flux. But I think specifically to your question, Regine, I think we'll have to see how the courts play this out. And I'm sure to whatever degree there are courts that rule in opposition to the administration, there'll be an appeals process, as there have been on so many other issues. So my sense is that we're going to have tariff uncertainty for quite some time.
Yeah, and I want to add on to what John's saying. So the main legal authority for tariffs is the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which basically allows the executive through the Department of Commerce to investigate particular industries to determine if importation of those goods constitutes a national security concern. So in the past, the Trump administration has initiated Section 232 investigations in steel, aluminum, auto, and automotive parts. And it's not just the finished product, it's the derivative products. So that's a national security umbrella through the Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce provides a report after the investigation with a recommendation to the president with respect to whether this industry's importations constitute a national security threat. And so, for example, there was a Supreme Court case, writ was denied. So basically the Supreme Court denied review of a case, USP Holdings, which came through the Court of Appeals Federal Circuit. that basically said, the petitioners challenged, this is an example of where we could go with tariffs. The petitioners challenged tariffs on steel importation under the arguments that, one, the procedures that the president followed, Trump, were not consistent with Section 232, and two, did not follow the Administrative Procedure Act of the U.S., it's under the U.S. Constitution, basically, and it basically says if you're going to issue a rule, you have to go through notice and comment rulemaking procedure. It can't be arbitrary, capricious, yada, yada, yada. So the Court of Appeals Federal Circuit ruled that the tariffs stand on the steel products because Section 232 is national security and falls out the ambit of the Administrative Procedure Act. The APA does not apply. So this is a pretty unique area, national security, and it all kind of hinges on these reports. So in addition to those four industries, beginning in January of this year, the Trump administration, as you all know, has initiated these investigations, Section 232 investigations, on 9 additional industries, including pharmaceuticals. And so I'm looking at the steel industry as an example of what could happen with the pharmaceutical industry, and I think that the pharmaceutical manufacturers who are well-funded, the big boys like Astra, who are well-funded, they're complying and bringing $50 billion of production into the United States, manufacturing example in Virginia for AstraZeneca, is because in steel, the president expanded the tariffs. When faced with these challenges, the president expanded it, right? So expanded it to more countries, right? You can exclude certain countries, certain allies like the UK, but expand it to all countries and went from, a 50% tariff, 25% tariff to a 50% tariff. So I do think that the president does have some power here to the extent that the importation of these raw essential materials, these active pharmaceutical ingredients, and the fact that, some of our biggest trading counterparties, China, India, are the main producers of it. I mean, look, if we're America first and we have the power to turn off the faucet, right, to control the outcome of some kind of foreign dispute, we're going to think about pulling that lever. So, the Trump administration purports to utilize national security, Section 232, of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to force domestic production, to decrease the trade deficit, and I do think there's a good chance that they'll probably win in court. And we also know through the Federalist Society's recommendations that the Trump administration has a lot of support at the Supreme Court. So if we're expecting an overturn, I wouldn't hold my breath.
Another question from the audience, and while we're looking for the next hand for that, I'll just say as a person who grew up in the health system supply chain, this isn't necessarily where we spent our time focusing, so I think it's really important and thank you for sharing this incredible knowledge, because these aren't the things that we thought about on a day-to-day basis. Do we have another question out here? All right, well, I'm going to resort to, we do have one here in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you for such an insightful presentation. I do have a question about the long run for healthcare in specific, for the industrialization and bringing that back to mainland. It just seems like we keep failing. We've had a recent glove supplier that has closed
Can you
doors.
hold up the mic just a little bit?
We had a recent supplier fail on this in America, bringing domestic supply back here. It's like we just can't figure that out. So I'm wondering what the long run play is with tariffs, trying to get suppliers to bring that manufacturing back. And you talked about the workforce. I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
A little bit more on the domestic manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking, is this plan of increasing production in the United States a sustainable strategy that won't kind of waver in the wind with the next administration that comes in? I think it's a good question, and we can only speculate. I think, so here's, at least with respect to pharmaceuticals, right? I'm a pharmacist and lawyer. That's my area. We do have to keep our eyes on devices and supplies that are probably going to get hit by the tariffs more. But at least with respect to pharmaceuticals, the Trump administration gave drug makers a 60-day window ending September 29th to commit to binding agreements to bring production in the United States and reduce the price of drugs charged, most favored nation. And if these binding agreements are not reached in this letter, the Trump administration stated that they would use every tool in their arsenal to go after at least the drug industry. And so what that has resulted in now, in terms of binding, what does binding constitute? I think the government wants to provide flexibility for the drug makers to comply and to make it the art of the deal. But what binding to me means a contract, something that you're on the line for. And so we've seen Roche invest in U.S. Facilities. We've seen AstraZeneca invest $50 billion in U.S. facilities. Novartis, Eli Lilly, $7 billion. So I do think that, at least in the pharmaceutical realm, at least from the brand side, I think that there probably will be some longer lasting impacts. On the generic side, that remains to be seen because, many times these generic active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers, API manufacturers, for example, in China, they basically have to be a part of the Chinese government. You can't have a company in China without registering basically with the government. So I can't really speculate on how the generic industry is going to remain and whether that production will be domesticated and remain domesticated.
Any other questions out there? All right, I have one for you, Mark. Looked like you were going to chime in, though.
Well, yeah, no, I wanted to note one other thing that John noted, which is, just to be clear, like I advise my clients, like, this isn't something you really have to pay attention to, or we could come up with a contingency strategy. But I do believe that the president is serious about this, and to the point where John was mentioning closing out alternative routes to get products into the United States, for example, through Mexico. That resounded with me because another focus of the Trump administration is fraud. And the government has noted that they're going to do a ton of fraud investigations. So when I'm looking at least in the pharmaceutical, we represent drug makers too. When I'm looking at that industry and I'm looking at things such as the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which requires drug pedigree requirements, I'm looking at things like the Pure Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, all these things that require good manufacturing practices, and you can't get active ingredients that meet certain specifications. I think there's going to be an added focus on those components of the drug supply chain with respect to pharmaceutical manufacturing to close up some of those loopholes and workarounds to get around the impacts of some of these tariffs and the rising prices for producing these products.
And Leanne, can I just add one thing to this? First of all, I want to take Mark's extremely superior body of knowledge on this sector and put it into a larger political context as well, especially when we talk about the administration's seriousness on these issues. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that, and this is whether one loves President Trump or hates President Trump, every president wants to be able to carry their legislative agenda through for as long as they possibly can through their administration. And I think you're seeing a very aggressive approach to tariff strategy that also provides for a broadening of the political base in support of the president, especially with bringing down the cost of pharmaceuticals. I mean, this is really what they call an 80-20 issue, probably 99-1. I don't know who's opposed for the most part. Everyday Americans, maybe health industry executives have a different perspective as to how it gets done properly, but almost everyone in America complains about the exorbitant cost of pharmaceuticals. So this is a very popular issue for President Trump, and again, as he's broadening the electoral base inside of his party, his number one concern right now is that his administration isn't necessarily 3.5 years to go, but a little over a year. Because if the Democratic Party wins back either house in November of 26, his legislative agenda is finished. And very frankly, if the Democratic Party wins the House, he'll almost certainly start being impeached in January of 2027. And that's the end of any type of, if we think things are polarized now, watch what happens if there's impeachment fever again in Washington. So I think they're trying to work as hard as they can right now through November of 26 from a presidential perspective to lock in Republican control of both houses through 2028. And I think that's also going to be a significant factor in addition to all of the very significant concerns you're bringing from a corporate planning and investment portfolio and cost effectiveness perspective that you're all rightly concerned with. But keep in mind the politics of this on a purely domestic political level in Washington, D.C.
John, I'm going to ask you the final question here. My husband and I are parents to 2 sons in their 20s, so I'm very encouraged that you're optimistic about the future for our next generation. You've spent a couple days with us here with this audience of suppliers, health system providers, and our GPOs. What final advice do you have for us with the context that you have for us to be considering in the healthcare supply chain?
It's probably a taller order than I'm able to answer in any well-informed way,
Okay.
Leanne. I appreciate the opportunity here to talk about this. I don't know that I have anything that is specific to the health industry, ladies and gentlemen. People like Mark are far better versed at this than I am. What I want to just give you a sense of is how interconnected everything that is taking place in Washington, D.C., and on a national level here in the United States, around the world, really is. I think sometimes our fellow Americans have a little bit too much of an inward-looking focus, and I understand that, right? We're a vast economy, a vast country of 330 million people, largely self-sufficient, but really almost nothing takes place on a significant level in the United States without either impacts from abroad or our repercussions in an outward direction that then reverberate back to us. And so the connectivity, the interconnectedness of the global economy, even along the lines of that first slide deck that I showed you, the fact that the global economy really depends on this free and open trading system that is very, very fragile and can be easily disrupted, whether it's because of reckless trade policies and, say, unilateral tariff strategies, whether because of conflicts that can erupt on a moment's notice. You know, we like to think that our political leaders are rational and well-heeled, and sometimes decisions are made for stupid and dishonorable reasons. But, you know, if you had asked people, and I don't mean to overly analogize here, but if you had asked people in Germany in 1910, when Germany was really at the apex of the Western world, what would their society be like in 20 or 30 years? I don't think they would have had any thought of what it would be like 25 years later with the end of World War II. And I'm not saying that's the American example, but what I'm saying is things can change very, very quickly. Stay on top of what is happening not only in Washington, but globally. The interconnectedness of the world is something that's going to become even deeper and more profound and more integrated in the years to come, simply because of the pace of world events, the interoperability of global technology, and the direct threat to American leadership from so many quarters worldwide. It's not specific to the healthcare industry, but it's the same general counsel that I can offer to industry leaders in almost every sector.
Great reminder for all of us. We are going to take about a 5-minute break. I know that's very short, but as John mentioned earlier, we have a jam-packed agenda for this morning. So please take a quick break. But in the meantime, join me in thanking Mark and John for sharing their talent and their experience with us.